My name is Madeline Stone. I'm 32 years old. The night that changed everything wasn't when I dragged a wounded comrade out of a burning Humvee in Kandahar, nor when I led a covert mission through the Hindu Kush Mountains. It happened in a ballroom drenched in roses, beneath glittering crystal chandeliers, in front of 300 wedding guests who thought they knew exactly who I was. I heard the whispers slicing through the laughter, sharp as shrapnel. She's not worthy of him. He's a soldier, and what does she have? The mocking laughter that followed hit harder than enemy fire. My bouquet trembled in my hands as his relatives smirked, treating me like the consolation prize their war hero son had settled for. They thought they knew me. They had no idea. And the truth was about to break them. The Riverside Country Club ballroom looked like something out of a fairy tale. Crystal chandeliers cast warm golden light across tables draped in ivory silk, each centerpiece a perfect arrangement of white roses and baby's breath that probably cost more than I'd made in a month during my first deployment. 300 guests in designer gowns and military dress uniforms filled the space with the kind of elegant chatter that comes with open bars and expensive venues. I stood near the bridal suite entrance in my custom wedding dress, simple, elegant, chosen more for how easily I could move in it than for any designer label. After 8 years of combat boots and body armor, heels felt like foreign objects strapped to my feet, and the flowing fabric seemed designed to trip me up at the worst possible moment. But it wasn't the dress that made me feel out of place. It was the way Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell's family looked at me. David's father stood near the bar, resplendent in his dress blues, surrounded by 3 decades of military connections who hung on his every word about strategy, leadership, and the proud tradition of service that ran in their family. A tradition I was apparently about to dilute. She seems nice. I heard his sister Margaret whisper to their cousin Julia, both women wearing the kind of understated jewelry that screamed old money and social connections. But really, what does she bring to this marriage? Margaret worked in public relations for a Fortune 500 company, had a master's degree from Georgetown, and drove a BMW that cost more than most people's annual salary. Julia was a federal prosecutor with political ambitions and a townhouse in Alexandria that had been featured in Southern Living. And me, as far as they knew, I was a government contractor who did consulting work that I couldn't discuss because of confidentiality agreements. I mean, David's a decorated Army Ranger, Julia continued, her voice carrying that particular tone of concern that barely masked pure judgment. He deserves someone who can match his accomplishments, someone who understands the military life. Someone who understands the military life. If they only knew how intimately I understood it. The irony was so thick I could taste it. While they questioned whether I was worthy of their war hero, I carried memories that would give them nightmares for the rest of their lives. The weight of decisions made in split seconds. The sound of incoming mortars. The smell of cordite and diesel fuel and fear that permeated every forward operating base I'd ever called home. Look at her. Margaret's voice dropped lower, but not low enough. Sweet, I'm sure, but she's so ordinary. David could have married anyone. Lieutenant Governor Hartwell's daughter was interested, you know. Now that would have been a match that made sense. Ordinary. The word hit like a sniper's bullet finding its mark. I thought about Kandahar Province, 2019, Operation Iron Thunder. The night I'd carried Staff Sergeant Rodriguez 300 yards through Taliban-controlled territory after our convoy hit an IED. His blood had soaked through my uniform as I dragged his unconscious body to the extraction point, whispering promises that I'd get him home to his wife and 2 kids. Ordinary women don't spend 4 months living in mountain caves, tracking high-value targets through terrain that would kill most people just from the altitude. They don't learn to speak Pashto well enough to pass for local, or master the art of moving through hostile territory without leaving a trace. But looking around this ballroom, surrounded by people who measured worth in social connections and career prestige, I felt more exposed than I'd ever felt in a combat zone. The thing is, Julia continued, warming to her theme, military wives need to be strong. They need to understand sacrifice, duty, honor. They need to be able to handle the pressure of deployment, the stress of uncertainty. The stress of uncertainty, I almost laughed out loud. They had no idea that I'd spent the better part of a decade managing uncertainty that would have broken most people. Leading small unit operations where one mistake meant everyone under my command died. making decisions with incomplete intelligence while enemy forces closed in from three sides. David needs someone who can support his career, Margaret added. Someone who can host dinners for his commanding officers, who knows how to navigate military social circles. Someone with substance. I fingered the simple silver bracelet on my wrist, the only jewelry I wore besides my engagement ring. They couldn't see the small scar on my left shoulder, where shrapnel had torn through my body armor during a firefight in Helmand Province. Couldn't see the surgical scars on my knee from when I'd jumped from a helicopter that was taking heavy fire. The substance they were questioning had been forged in places they couldn't pronounce, tested in situations they couldn't imagine, proven in ways that would never appear on a resume or social media profile. "I just worry about David," Julia said, her voice taking on that tone of sisterly concern that was really thinly veiled criticism. "He's worked so hard to build his reputation. His career is everything to him. He needs a partner who enhances that, not someone who—" She didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. Someone who what? Someone who'd spent her 20s in places where luxury meant clean water and a dry place to sleep? Someone whose idea of formal wear was dress blues with combat ribbons they'd never understand? Someone who measured success not in social status but in how many of her people made it home alive? I felt my breath catch as the memories hit me unbidden. The weight of an M4 carbine in my hands, the taste of dust and diesel in my mouth, the sound of Chinook rotors beating against thin mountain air as we extracted from objectives they'd never hear about on the evening news. The fellowship dinner 2 months ago, where I'd sat next to a general's wife who'd spent 20 minutes explaining why military spouses needed to know their place and support their husbands' careers without competing for attention. The charity gala where David's commanding officer had patted my hand condescendingly and said how nice it was that David had found someone normal who could keep him grounded after his deployments. The family barbecue where his uncle had asked what I did for work, then lost interest the moment I said government consulting, as if anything that didn't involve combat or command wasn't worth discussing. They saw fragility where I'd learned to hide strength. They saw simplicity where I'd mastered complexity that would have overwhelmed most people. They saw someone who needed protection when I'd spent a decade being the protector. "She's not worthy of him," Margaret finally said, the words sharp enough to cut through the elegant chatter that surrounded us. "He's a soldier, and what does she have?" The mocking laughter that followed was worse than any enemy fire I'd ever faced. At least in combat, you knew where the threats were coming from. This felt like betrayal from people who were supposed to become family. I gripped my bouquet tighter, the stems cutting into my palms through the silk ribbon wrapped around them. Around me, the ballroom continued its elegant dance of conversation and celebration, but I felt like I was watching it all from behind bulletproof glass. This was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. Instead, it had become the most exposed I'd ever felt. More vulnerable than I'd been during night raids in enemy territory. More isolated than I'd been during solo reconnaissance missions in hostile terrain. At least in Afghanistan, I'd known who I was. I'd been Staff Sergeant Madeline Stone, Special Operations, someone whose skills and judgment had kept people alive in situations where failure meant death. Here, I was just the bride who wasn't good enough. The woman who didn't measure up. The ordinary girl who somehow thought she deserved a war hero. But as I stood there, absorbing their casual cruelty like small arms fire, I realized something that would change everything. They were about to discover exactly who they'd been underestimating. And David was about to prove that he knew exactly who he'd chosen to marry. The laughter was still echoing around the ballroom when I heard the sound that changed everything. Chair legs scraping against marble. Sharp, deliberate, cutting through the elegant chatter like a blade through silk. David stood up. In 8 years of knowing him, I'd seen that posture exactly 3 times. Once during a Taliban ambush in Kunar province. Once when a drunken Marine had gotten aggressive with a female lieutenant at a base in Germany. And once when his commanding officer had made the mistake of questioning his tactical judgment in front of his entire unit. It was the posture of a man who'd reached his breaking point and was about to remind everyone in the room exactly who they were dealing with. "Excuse me." His voice cut through the ballroom like a command echoing across a parade ground. Every conversation stopped dead. 300 heads turned toward the man in dress blues, who'd just shifted from loving groom to something far more dangerous. Margaret's wine glass froze halfway to her lips. Julia's mouth hung open mid-whisper. Even Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell, a man who'd spent 30 years commanding respect in rooms full of generals, went completely silent. David's eyes swept across his family, his friends, his father's military connections, landing on each face with the kind of precision that comes from years of threat assessment in hostile territory. "I couldn't help but overhear some conversation about my fiancé," he said, his voice carrying that particular tone of controlled fury that every soldier recognizes immediately. Specifically, questions about what she brings to this marriage. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. Around us, waiters had stopped moving. The string quartet had fallen silent. Even the bartender had paused mid-pour, sensing that something significant was about to happen. "Since there seems to be some confusion," David continued, his voice getting quieter and somehow more intimidating, "let me clarify something for everyone in this room." He turned to look directly at his sister, his cousin, his father's friends who'd been nodding along with their assessments of my inadequacy. "Staff Sergeant Madeline Stone," he said, and I felt my blood turn to ice water. "Special Operations Command. 8 years of service, 3 combat deployments, 2 Bronze Stars, a Silver Star, and a Purple Heart." The gasps were audible now. I watched Margaret's face go white as bone, watched Julia's eyes widen in shock, watched his father's military colleagues suddenly sit up straighter as they processed what they'd just heard. "But that's not why I'm marrying her," David's voice carried clearly through the stunned silence. "I'm marrying her because she's the woman who saved my entire unit in Afghanistan." The temperature in that ballroom dropped 10 degrees. Every eye in the room turned toward me, and suddenly I wasn't the inadequate bride who didn't deserve their war hero. I was something they couldn't comprehend, couldn't categorize, couldn't dismiss. "The 15th of November, 2019, David continued, his voice taking on the clinical precision of an after-action report. "Forward Operating Base Chapman. Our convoy hit an IED 12 clicks outside Kandahar. 3 vehicles destroyed, 7 wounded, 2 Kia. Taliban forces moving in from 3 sides." I could see it happening in real time, the shift in their faces as they tried to reconcile the woman in the wedding dress with the soldier David was describing. The confusion, the disbelief, the dawning recognition that they'd been catastrophically wrong about who I was. Our medic was down. Our radio was dead. We were trapped in a kill zone with wounded soldiers and no way to call for extraction. David's voice never wavered, but I could see the muscle in his jaw tightening as he relived that night. That's when Staff Sergeant Stone took command. The memories hit me like incoming fire, the weight of an M4 carbine in my hands, the taste of cordite and diesel fuel, the sound of AK-47 seconds echoing off canyon walls as Taliban fighters closed in on our position. She organized our defense, triaged our wounded, and coordinated our extraction while taking direct fire from enemy combatants. She carried Staff Sergeant Rodriguez 300 yards through hostile territory to the landing zone. She saved 6 lives that night, including mine. Margaret was crying now, tears streaming down her face as she realized what she'd done. Julia had gone completely pale, gripping the edge of the table like she might collapse. Around the ballroom, military officers who'd spent the evening questioning my worth were staring at me with something that looked like awe. "The woman you've been dismissing as ordinary," David continued, his voice cutting through their shock like a knife, "has been awarded the Silver Star for gallantry in action. She's led special operations missions that are still classified. She's saved more lives in the past 8 years than most people will touch in their entire careers." The silence stretched on for what felt like hours. I could hear the air conditioning cycling, could hear the distant sound of traffic from the street below, could hear my own breathing as 300 people processed the fact that they'd been mocking one of the most decorated female soldiers of her generation. "So when you ask what she brings to this marriage," David's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, somehow making it more powerful than if he'd been shouting, "the answer is everything. She brings courage, sacrifice, loyalty, and a strength that most people can't even imagine." He turned to look at me then, and I saw something in his eyes that made my chest tight with emotion. Not just love, but recognition, pride. The kind of respect that can only come from someone who truly understands what you've sacrificed. "She brings 8 years of putting other people's lives before her own. She brings the kind of character that's forged in places where character means the difference between life and death. She brings honor. The word hung in the air like a challenge. In a room full of military families who claimed to understand honor, David had just defined it in terms they couldn't argue with. And if anyone in this room has a problem with that, his voice carried that unmistakable tone of command authority. You can take it up with me after the ceremony. The transformation was immediate and complete. Margaret was openly sobbing now, her perfectly applied makeup running down her cheeks in black streams. Julia looked like she wanted to crawl under the table and disappear. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell was staring at me with the kind of respect reserved for people who'd earned their place in rooms where life and death decisions were made. But it was the look in David's eyes that mattered most. As he sat back down and reached for my hand, I saw something that made every moment of doubt, every whispered insult, every questioning stare worth enduring. I saw a man who knew exactly who he'd chosen to marry, who understood that the woman in the wedding dress was the same woman who'd carried wounded soldiers through enemy fire, who recognized that strength didn't always come in the form people expected. "Are you okay?" he whispered, his thumb tracing over my knuckles. I looked around that ballroom at faces that had gone from dismissive to shocked to ashamed in the span of 3 minutes. At people who would spend the rest of their lives knowing they'd underestimated someone whose courage in combat had saved American lives. "I'm perfect," I whispered back, and for the first time all day, I meant it. The woman they'd pitied was someone they'd never be brave enough to become. The bride they'd dismissed had proven herself in ways they'd never be tested. And the man beside me had just made sure everyone in that room understood exactly what that meant. The silence that followed David's words was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Not the tense quiet before an ambush, where danger hummed just beneath the surface. Not the focused silence of a tactical operations center where lives hung in the balance. This was something deeper, heavier, the kind of silence that settles over a battlefield after the fighting stops and everyone realizes the true cost of what just happened. 300 people sat frozen in their seats, champagne glasses suspended halfway to their lips, conversations abandoned mid-sentence. The crystal chandeliers continued casting their golden light across the ballroom, but something fundamental had shifted in the atmosphere. The elegant wedding celebration had become something else, entirely a reckoning. Margaret was the first to move. Her hands shook as she set down her wine glass, the crystal chiming against the marble table like a bell tolling. Tears had destroyed her perfectly applied makeup, leaving dark streaks down her cheeks that she made no effort to wipe away. She kept opening her mouth as if to speak, then closing it again, like someone who'd just realized they'd been shouting obscenities in a cathedral. Julia sat motionless beside her, staring at me with the kind of expression people get when they witness something that fundamentally changes their understanding of the world. Her face had gone ashen, her Georgetown law degree and federal prosecutor credentials suddenly feeling very small in a room where real courage had just been defined in terms she'd never experienced. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell cleared his throat, a sound that would have commanded attention in any other context but now seemed almost apologetic. He was looking at me with the kind of respect reserved for peer officers, the recognition passing between his eyes and mine that said we belonged to the same brotherhood, had walked the same paths through places where character was measured in life and death decisions. Around us, his military colleagues were having their own moments of realization. Colonels and majors who'd spent the evening making polite conversation about my government consulting work now understood they'd been talking to someone whose clearance level was probably higher than theirs, whose operational experience made their staff positions look like desk jobs. David's hand found mine under the table, his fingers intertwining with mine in a grip that was both protective and proud. When I turned to look at him, I saw something in his eyes that made my chest tight with emotion, not just love, but vindication. The look of a man who just watched the woman he chose prove herself in ways that would silence every doubt forever. "I should have said something sooner," he whispered. His voice meant only for me. "I should have protected you from this." I shook my head slightly. "You protected me when it mattered most." And he had. Not by shielding me from their judgment. I'd faced worse than family disapproval in places where bullets were the least of my concerns. He'd protected me by making sure they understood exactly who they'd been dismissing, by establishing that respect for me wasn't optional, it was required. The transformation rippling through the ballroom was almost visible. Relatives who'd been whispering about my inadequacy now sat in stunned silence, processing the fact that they'd been mocking someone whose courage under fire had saved American lives. Friends who'd questioned whether I was good enough for their war hero now understood that I'd earned my place through trials they couldn't imagine. The string quartet, sensing that whatever had just happened was significant, began playing again softly, tentatively, as if testing whether the elegant celebration could resume or if everything had permanently changed. Margaret finally found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "Madeline, we had no idea. I'm so sorry." I looked at this woman who'd spent the evening explaining why I wasn't worthy of her brother, who'd questioned what I brought to a marriage with their family's golden son. Now she was apologizing with the kind of desperate sincerity that comes from realizing you've made a mistake that can't be undone. "You're right," I said quietly, my voice carrying clearly in the hushed ballroom. "You had no idea." The words weren't cruel, but they weren't kind either. They were simply true, and sometimes truth cuts deeper than any insult. Julia leaned forward, her federal prosecutor confidence completely shattered. We should have asked, should have tried to understand, should have shown basic respect to the woman your family member chose to marry, I finished for her. Regardless of what you thought I'd accomplished. The point landed like incoming artillery. The issue wasn't that they'd underestimated my military service, it was that they'd felt entitled to judge my worth in the first place, to treat me like a candidate auditioning for their approval rather than a woman their son and brother had already chosen. David squeezed my hand, and I could see pride radiating from every line of his posture. This was the woman he'd fallen in love with not despite her strength, but because of it. Not in spite of her achievements, but because she was someone who'd proven herself in the crucible where true character is forged. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, standing again but this time with his hand still holding mine, "I think we have a wedding to finish." The ceremony proceeded, but everything had changed. The whispers that had followed me down the aisle were replaced by awed silence. The dismissive glances became respectful nods. The family members who'd questioned my place in their ranks now understood they were witnessing something historic, the marriage of two warriors who'd found each other across battlefields and ballrooms. When the officiant asked if anyone objected to our union, the silence was absolute. When David kissed me at the altar, the applause was thunderous. Not polite wedding applause, but the kind of sustained ovation reserved for people who've earned genuine admiration. As we walked back down the aisle together, my hand in his, I felt something I'd never experienced in civilian settings. I felt seen. Not as the woman who wasn't quite good enough, not as the bride who needed to prove herself worthy, but as exactly who I was, someone who'd served with honor, who'd saved lives, who'd earned her place through sacrifice and courage. The reception that followed was different too. Margaret approached me with genuine tears, asking if I'd forgive her ignorance. Julia wanted to know if I'd consider speaking at her law school about women in combat roles. Military officers who'd spent the evening making small talk about the weather now wanted to discuss tactics, deployments, the real challenges of modern warfare. But the moment that mattered most came near the end of the evening, when the crowd had thinned and David and I stood together on the dance floor, swaying to music that seemed designed for exactly this kind of perfect imperfection. "Any regrets?" he asked, his voice soft against my ear. I looked around the ballroom where hours earlier I'd felt so small, so judged, so inadequate. Now I saw it for what it really was, just another mission successfully completed, another challenge overcome, another situation where quiet strength had proven more powerful than loud assumptions. "None," I said, and meant it completely. Because on that day, I didn't just gain a husband, I gained back my truth. The truth about who I was, what I'd accomplished, and what I deserved, not because someone finally recognized it, but because I'd finally stopped hiding it. The woman who'd carried wounded soldiers through enemy fire was the same woman who deserved to be celebrated, respected, and loved exactly as she was. And anyone who had a problem with that could take it up with my husband. Have you ever been underestimated by people who should have known better? Pass this story to someone who's been judged, dismissed, or told they don't measure up. Sometimes the most important battles are fought in ballrooms, and the greatest victories happen when we finally stop apologizing for being extraordinary. Every story deserves to be heard. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more cinematic stories of courage and love.